If we look at some of the best game art in the past decade, one thing it tends to have in common is that the game art is quite unique. It's well executed, but also hasn't really been seen before. These are games that I praise fairly often, and on the flip side, I sometimes criticize games for being generic or dull. Not only that, in my last video, I talked about how one of the problems I believe occurs with pixel art is that it's a very popular medium and also has quite heavy constraints. And this makes a lot of pixel art games feel a bit samey. And while I do believe you can overcome this issue, like with Pizza Tower or Hyperlight Drifter, I generally believe that if you want to make unique game art, it will be easier to do so with hand-drawn art. And this is actually quite important. Like if you look at my game art, it isn't that unique looking. People are fond of saying it looks like a poor man's version of Hollow Knight. But I can actually make it slightly more unique than what I usually make. By changing a few things, my game art could look like this. I'll talk more about this scene later, because I think there's a good way and a bad way to make unique art. But I first want to talk about why I generally don't make my art like this, and instead make my art like this. And I mentioned this in my last video. My game art looks like it does because this is how I do my traditional art. Some of you will scoff at this and say this looks nothing alike. But instead of thinking of the overall vibe, just look at the rocks, or the leaves, or the mushrooms. They're kind of the same. They're drawn kind of the same. And if we look at this scene, it looks a bit different, a bit unique, but frankly this is the same art. The problem is, I can't really feasibly change the way I draw, so I don't. To me it's a question of ROI, so what you expect the return on your investment to be. Frankly, I think that everything in terms of game art should be evaluated through some type of cost-benefit analysis. And frankly, you can even evaluate this in very basic terms like the triple constraint. Or phrased differently, good, fast, cheap, choose two. That is, whether or not you should make your game art unique kind of depends on how easy it is for you to do it. That is, how quickly you can make unique game art and whether or not it will actually help you sell more copies or make a better game. And this actually largely explains why the art on this channel looks like it does. First and foremost, whether you need to make unique game art kind of depends on your niche. If you make a Factorio-like game, well, there isn't that much competition in that niche. So your art doesn't really have to look that unique to stand out. It might frankly not even have to look good in order to sell. So from a business perspective, spending time making your art amazing might actually be wasting time. But if you're making a platformer, a roguelike, or a Metroidvania, you're not making a niche game. If your game doesn't look good or interesting, it probably won't sell. So in this case, managing to make your game unique is frankly in your best interest. But it can't just be unique. A unique turd is still a turd. If uniqueness comes at the expense of other more important things, you're still making a bad choice. And here lies the problem. Let's list all the ways my game art looks like Hollow Knight. I almost always use black line art. I almost always use blur and atmospheric perspective. I use a quite thick and simple style. I quite often have both saturated and high contrast scenes. And yes, Hollow Knight is fairly saturated. It's monochromatic most of the time, but still uses quite saturated colors. I also rarely use textures, or if I do, I use very simple textures. Not to mention my characters are almost exactly the same size and shape as the knight and also have big black eyes. So why do I use line art? Well, I think in general you can achieve quite a polished look quicker with line art. I actually started out not using line art, and it took about 3 times as long to create each asset, and still managed to look worse. So skipping line art isn't really worth it for me, even if it would make my art look more unique. But what I could do is color my line art some other color. What about blur and atmospheric perspective? I could change those, right? Well, it would make my game art more unique, but it would come at the expense of readability, so the game would play worse. But I could make the use of just atmospheric perspective and skip the blur and still have quite decent readability. What about my simple style? Well, if you're like me and have developed a doodly style over a long period of time, changing that drawing style is a huge cost. Learning to draw a new way is such an immense time sink that it can't possibly be worth it. So I'm honestly quite stuck with it. What about having high contrast and saturated scenes? Well, I naturally gravitate to slightly more saturated colors. So I personally feel that I always end up making quite bad color choices when I go for unsaturated scenes. But I can always make my scene have less dark foreground. And then in terms of texture, I can actually render my assets a bit differently, vary the colors more, and make it a bit more playful. Without coming too much at the expense of readability or time, I can make my game art a bit more unique. But to be honest, I probably can't make it much more unique than this without it being a bad choice. And if you still think this looked like a Hollow Knight clone, then I guess it sucks to be me. But being unique isn't the be-all end-all. In fact, I would probably rank several things as more important, such as readability, aesthetics, and art direction. This is kind of why even in this scene, my character still looks like it does. I want my character to be quite simple and cute. There are frankly very few games where I really like the characters. Ori, Sheepo, Islets, Rainworld, Have a Nice Death, The End is Nigh, Cuphead, Tales of Iron, Candle. These are the type of characters I like. Conversely, I don't really like the type of characters in games like Eternal Noctis or Ender Lilies. And this is also more important than uniqueness. You have to some extent vibe with your own art. It can't be unique if it isn't your taste. If it is far away from your taste, you'll have trouble evaluating it. So I can't really change the look of how I draw the face too much, or the vibe of the character overall. But I obviously could change the shape of it. So just to illustrate, I could take the mushroom character, remove the mushroom cap, change the body to the shape of that of a dog or a sheep, and make the animation be sort of bouncy. Now the character looks a bit stupid, but I guess it could technically work. But none of this explains why I always make my art like this instead of this. Well, first of all, I don't actually know if my potential audience necessarily prefers this over this. Maybe they do, but if they don't, it might be a bad choice. As it stands, the biggest reason I never make my art like this is that this is about 10 to 15% faster to make. And I make all my scenes to explain a concept, not to sell a game. So it has to look good, but it doesn't have to look unique. But with that said, I think it actually might make sense to make game art like this, because the added time to make it isn't that bad. I can draw the exact same way I normally do. I can still maintain all the benefits of it. I can still maintain a cute aesthetic. I just change one or two small things, like the texture, and it gives a different enough vibe. But depending on your circumstance, making your art look original might be too big of a task to overcome. This is one of the things I mentioned in regards for pixel art. If you look at the things I changed to make this scene, I basically changed nothing. I kept the values a bit lighter, changed the line art color, changed the line art thickness, and added some texture. And what I find tricky with a lot of pixel art is that it will be slightly more tricky to just change the easy things. I think in general, in order to achieve a different and unique look, you kind of need to learn to draw a new and different way. It can be done, it can even be done well, but it can run the risk of interfering with more important goals, such as the aesthetics and theme of your game. And I often feel that that means that the ROI on it will be bad. Now all of this might seem kind of boring, and as if I'm taking the fun out of making a game. And yes, that is what I'm doing. But I think you should always be cognizant of the cost of any choice you're making. If you want to skip doing things optimally and do what feels right and what you believe in instead, that might also make sense. But I don't think you should make that choice with blinders on. This is also why I might talk about something like how showing the horizon and the sky, like this, might not be a good choice. It's obvious that you can do it, but you should be aware of the compromises you might have to make and the difficulty that you might have when trying to make it. In my mind, I feel like the ROI on this is terrible. It's a really cool idea, but I think it often looks worse and takes significantly more time to make. But you'll always have to look at your case and if you have a decent solution in mind. Thanks for watching. Bye.